thing he found was stored, until finally finding the one holding many different kinds of electrical equipment, including adapters necessary to make use of the appliances he had brought on board with him. The small white boxes had a uniform Type plug on one side and a Type-C outlet on the other. Not bothering to go back into the bathroom, he just plugged the thing into the nearest outlet, together with the hairdryer, and began to blow the hot air through his hair. Usually, he would make sure to keep it in from while doing so. But right now, he only cared about getting it to dry as quickly as possible. While he did so, he looked at the last items decorating his room. A large desk with a corresponding office chair he had brought with him from Earth stood on the right wall, not visible from the entrance due to the bathroom blocking the view. On top of it laid what looked like a black box. It was his laptop, which he would use concurrently with the ship's computer during his research. While the two devices were not compatible, he could do a lot of his work on the go and then just copy it into his workplace when done. That way, he was not confined into his laboratory for long stretches of time. This was especially useful because he was much more familiar with the programs he had used for most of his education than with the ones the ship had to offer. The screen of the board computer was also located directly above the desk, a good bit too high to be used comfortably by a human-sized person. After a while, his hair began to feel soft and warm. Stroking through it slowly, he turned off the device and laid it aside. Rubbing his eyes, he stepped back over to the cupboard and decided to put at least some underwear on. While dropping the towel and stepping into his boxers, he once again felt the familiar prickling feeling of eyes on his body. He shot around. Unlike the door of the isolation cabin, the door of his new domicile had no windows in it, and it was shut tight. He had not heard it open since he had entered. Also, the room had still been sealed up until he had entered a few minutes ago. In conclusion, there was no way somebody was with him in the room or could otherwise see him right now. Yet every time he got more and more sure that he did not imagine things. On the other hand, he was definitely too tired to care right now, so he decided to drop it, until the next morning at least. The bed was too much of a temptation at the moment. The clock integrated above his bed, telling him that the day had reached its 8th hour by now. Only 2 hours until the next day. It really was a good thing. He made his work hours himself. Otherwise, his Earth rhythm would probably be a big problem. The uniform measurements were all so short, at least the ones mattering day to day. Well, except for the uniform hours, of course, which were pretty much just hours. In thought, he slowly meandered over to the bed, just tipping over forward, landing face first on the mattress. He laid still for a moment, before awkwardly rolling to the middle of the thing without lifting himself. It took him a while, since the bed was way bigger than he was used to. Quickly, he ordered the room system to shut off the lights. With a click, the room fell into darkness. When he had finally made himself comfortable, he debated whether or not he should slip under the covers. And while it was definitely too warm for that, he knew that not tucking in would not really be helping his insomnia, and he could really use a good night's rest. So he quickly wrapped himself in the blanket, immediately feeling like having entered a soft, fluffy sauna. But being wrapped as a tight bundle of blankets was how he slept best. However, it still took him a long time to finally drift off to sleep. His sleep was deep and plagued by strange dreams. Even in outer space, he somehow was still dreaming about not having studied for some test in school or about some surreal family gatherings. he never had any part in. When he awoke, he felt sweaty and hot, his mouth dry as a bone. Also, his right arm had fallen asleep and had turned limp at his side. He struggled out of the blanket bed, ordering the lights back on with a hoarse voice. It took him a while to finally free himself of the mass of fabric, especially since his right arm was pretty much useless and his left arm still hurt from its wounds. Once he had freed himself at last, he immediately started massaging his by now aching right limb, using his left hand to move it around a bit, then slowly forming a fist and releasing it again until feeling finally came back to it in form of 1,000 and back to it in form of ants crawling around underneath his skin. Slowly, he dragged himself into the bathroom to freshen up a bit. A few minutes later, he stepped back out into his room, finally feeling at least somewhat like a human again, having finished his morning routine. He also picked up the clothes he had just left lying on the ground yesterday and threw them into cleaning. He yawned as he wandered over towards the closet in order to get dressed. His arm was already looking much better than the day before. He really had to wonder exactly how sharp Sheeta's claws had to be in order to cut him so cleanly. Maybe he would ask her about it sometime. Or would that be weird? His stomach growled, interrupting his thoughts, and reminding him that he by now had probably not eaten for almost a day. He glanced over his shoulder at the clock. It was halfway between the 5th and 6th hour. He scowled as he realized that he had not slept long at all. But right now eating was more of a priority. While still pulling his left sleeve over his arm, he made his way towards the door, ordering it to open. The metal gate noisily made way for him. The hallway was unusually busy. The early shift had just ended. So many crew members were returning to their quarters, either to get some rest or just making a pit stop before going on with their day. Luckily for him, members of the research team were not integrated into the shift system. Once again, he weaved around his colleagues, trying not to either get trampled or accidentally tipping someone over. Of course, most crew members were considered enough to also dodge him. But it was much easier for him to just get out of the way if a collision was imminent. That strategy worked well enough, until someone coming from the opposite direction had the exact same idea. The both of them collided hard, and James had to stumble a few steps back. The other person was not as lucky, having lost their balance and landing on the ground with a painful-looking impact. "Oh, no, I am so sorry," James immediately called out, leaning forward to extend a hand to the person he had accidentally knocked down. "What the hell are you made of?" The person from the ground replied, while slowly propping themselves up. "For a second I thought I'd run into a damn wall." They looked up at him, seeing his extended hand, and took it. With little effort, James pulled them to their feet. And in the motion, he realized that he recognized them. "Yeah, again, sorry about that," James said, while he looked at the big figure rubbing their back from the pain. "You're Pippa, right?" At that, the dark eyes of the woman shot up at him and looked at his face with an inquisitive expression. Long ears rotated in his direction as if that would help her hear the last sentence better. Then, after a few seconds, the light of understanding filled her squint. "Oh, that's you. Well, you totally butchered that. But I'll forgive you, since you've only seen it signed," the large marsupial replied with a pretended loftiness. Then, a bit of her vigor faded as she realized that she had to ask him, "What was your name again?" "And James Aldwin. And if you don't want me to butcher it again, you might want to show me how it is done." James remarked. Pippa took a moment to carefully pronounce her name. Turns out the PS were supposed to be pronounced separately with a tiny pause in between. She herself had some problems with the J sound when trying to get James' name right. But after some tries, both of them were able to confidently address each other. "So where are you off to, James?" Pippa asked after James had just explained that only one of the two names was necessary while addressing him. "I was going to get something to eat," James replied, putting a hand on his growling stomach. "Wicked. Can I come? I was going to get something from my room, but I can do that later. 'Cause now that you've mentioned it, I could use some chow myself," Pippa blurted out, excitedly wriggling her ears. James was not thrilled about the idea. Not that he did not want to take her along. He just had already decided only to make a pit stop at the Herbivore Casino today to grab some sides before actually going to eat in the carnivore one. He had already asked if that would be possible the day before. Or had it been 2 days by now? It didn't matter. Anyway, he had been told by the staff of the casino that it would not bother anyone if he brought plant-based food into the carnivore casino, but that it would probably be best not to bring meat into the herbivore one. Most people in there would be not only unnerved by that, but also repulsed by the sight. Now, how would he approach this, figuring it would probably be best to just tell the truth? He apologetically explained his omnivorous diet and his resulting breakfast plans to Pippa, who stared at him through his whole explanation, her eyes growing ever wider. But what he had at first assumed to be repulsion or fear turned out to be not that at all, when Pippa responded enthusiastically, "Cool. So you can just eat anything. I want to see." James was a bit taken aback. Not quite the reaction he had expected. "I mean, sure, if you want to. But, like I said, I'll be eating in the carnivore casino," he retorted, physically falling back from the wave of energy emanating from Pippa. "You also said that it is okay to bring normal food in there. So there is no reason why I can't eat there too," she stated smugly, crossing her arms triumphantly and straightening up to her full height. That was at least technically true, thought James. Even if he did not agree with the normal food part, he also somehow highly doubted that anyone would actually care at all in the end. Also, he was getting extremely hungry by now. And it did sound nice to have someone accompany him, instead of having to bother someone already there, if he wanted to talk. So he just shrugged and motioned for her to come along. Pippa really was a bundle of energy, happily babbling away about all kinds of things and peppering him with questions about what he could or could not eat. As a deathworld omnivore, most organic things were fair game, although she was quite surprised to find out that most hard plant matter was one of the big. In the casino, he had to wait for a moment, having already picked out a few sides, while Pippa was filling an entire large tray with different copious amounts of greens and roots. Once she was done, he led her out of the door and over to the next big room, reading carnivores on the door. "You know, I've always wanted to go in there," Pippa confessed, "but I never really got the chance until today." "Why not ask one of your colleagues if you could accompany them?" James inquired, while motioning for the door to open with one hand. For the first time, Pippa looked slightly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one leg onto the other while answering, "I mean, I could have done that. You don't really get along too... I don't really get along... Most of EM creeped me the hell out." James was doubtful of that claim and looked at her unbelieving. You don't seem to have a problem with me. And I am technically a carnivore, he stated incredulously, lifting one eyebrow at her while stepping through the gate. The carnivore casino was smaller than the herbivore one. The weird, bumpy, one-size-fits-all tables were the same. But there were much fewer, and most people were sitting on top of them instead of in front of them. The counters, however, were built quite different, while the basic metal rag in front of metal counter model was the same. They were equipped with many pots and deep dishes, lamps, and sheets. Some had glass containers filled with ice on them. Also, almost all the food was cooked or processed, and no raw items were in sight. The variety was also much smaller than that of the other room. And, to James's delight, it was much less crowded. Well, you are the first carnivore ever who just casually approached me. I mean, sure, you also did that staring thing that you types always do. But other than that, you were nice enough. You just stood there, in your little window, striking up a conversation, all exited about getting out soon. I figured, hey, that guy can't be too bad. You know? Pippa rambled while they crossed the room towards the desks. James wanted to let her sit down first, before he went to get his food, so that she would at least be comfortable while waiting. Scanning the room, he realized that none of the tables were empty, so they would probably have to join someone in their meal. He started to ponder which table would be best suited for Pippa to wait at. He didn't have to think for long, however, because a loud whistle suddenly pierced through the room, causing him to turn towards its source. It was the medic who had patched his arm together earlier, sitting on top of a table near the rightmost wall. Her piercing blue eyes were aimed squarely at him, as she waved with one of her 4 white feathered arms. Next to her sat another member of her people, wearing a yellow identifier, also looking at him. Their feathers were a very dark brown, almost black, striking a stark contrast to her snow-white form, but their eyes were just as blue. James thought they would probably be good enough, especially since Pippa would probably know at least one of them, seeing as she was also part of the medical team. So, he motioned for his companion to follow him as he began to move towards the table. "Hello, James," greeted the medic, as he came into range for a comfortable conversation. "How is your arm?" "Much better." "Thanks for your concern," James replied, smiling, and waved his arm around a bit to exemplify his statement. She let out a small chirping sound that James could not quite interpret, before pointing at him with one arm and turning towards her company, stating, "That is the guy I told you about before. The one Shida used as a scratching post?" The addressed inquired, while eyeing up James amusedly. James sighed laughingly, while Pippa looked over to him curiously. Apparently, medical privacy was not something that existed among the medical staff on board. "That would be the one," he confirmed, lifting his hand as if to verify his presence. "The name is James. And that behind me is Pippa." The eyes of the raptors wandered past him, looking at his companion instead, taking in her appearance, and especially inspecting the tray she was carrying. James had by now reached the table and rested his own small tray on top of it. "Ah, it's you. So your name is Pippa, huh?" The medic ascertained, seeming happy to have recognized her. So, they did not quite know each other. So much for that assumption. Already you. James did, however, have to admit that he was impressed at her ability to pronounce Pippa's name without lips. The medic then introduced herself and her company by pointing at first herself and then them while saying their names, which James had no hope of ever pronouncing correctly, since they consisted of small series of chirps and whistles, which must have sounded much more at home in their native language than in the uniform one. After presumably watching all the color drain from James' face, especially since he felt pretty bad not knowing her name until now, she snickered and proposed, "But you mammalians may call me Fither, and my mate usually goes with Cliff." Cliff nodded at that, while making eye contact with James, who probably looked more gracious than he should. Fither just kept snickering to herself, apparently quite used to people with a lower range of vocalizations than her. "Well, it is nice to meet you, Cliff," James said, nodding back at him. "Yeah, it's a pleasure," Pippa chimed in with him. "The pleasure is mine," Cliff answered, before turning and taking a bite from his food, which to James looked almost like a turkey leg. It smelled good as well, causing his stomach to grumble once more. Turning to Pippa, he put forward, "You have a seat while I go get something to eat, all right?" Pippa nodded at him, seeming much more unsure of her plan to eat around here after having seen Cliff tear some meat from the bone of his meal. James gave her an encouraging smile while walking past her and going over to the counters. Quickly, he picked out his food. There were a lot of people processed meat, but luckily just pan-frying it over some heat was something pretty much everyone had come up with. So he just grabbed himself some big slabs of some light meat, roasted nice and brown. Since options considering beverages were extremely limited, he took some water to wash it down with him. Then he quickly returned to the table. The two predators were curiously eyeing Pippa, while she meekly took small bites of her food when James arrived, slapping his new tray down next to his first one and hoisting himself up onto the tabletop, apparently giving Pippa quite a fright in the process. "Good grief," she yelled out, while he searched for a more comfortable position on the hard surface. "What did you do that for?" Sorry, James laughed and picked up one of the bowls he had brought with him from the other casino. If was honest, he wasn't really sorry. He was one of those assholes that enjoyed giving people a little scare every now and again. So not to be intrusive or anything, but why did you decide to eat here? Fither asked, tilting her head. So James and Pippa took a moment to explain why they were eating together today. All the while, James was scarfing down his food. "Fascinating," Cliff exclaimed, gesturing with the bare bone left over of his food. "I've never heard of herbivores actually wanting to watch someone consume meat before." Pippa, who had become considerably more comfortable over time, perked up and explained, "Well, it's not really about the meat part. To be honest, that's still kinda iffy for me, but you gotta admit, someone just casually chowing down on anything they want does sound pretty cool, doesn't it?" Fither and Cliff seemed to be amused by her enthusiasm and looked over at James for a moment. To him, it did not really look that different when people ate meat instead of plants, so he just shrugged while taking big bites of both plants and meat. "Well, I can at least understand being curious about his biology," Fither endorsed her claim. "Deathworlders are always quite fascinating. You never know what quirks such an environment has bred." "Well, you can say," Cliff supported her claim. "Speaking of quirky Deathworlders, did you and Sheeta get things settled with each other?" The last part was addressed towards James, who was currently in the middle of chewing a mouthful of meat and thus took some time to answer. "Right. You guys said something about her scratching up James earlier, didn't you? What's up with that? Pippa chimed in before he could say anything. James swallowed hard, hurting his throat in the process, and had to take a few swigs of water before answering. Yeah, we cleared it up. No bad blood here. Why didn't you just ask her? Aren't you two working together? Fither inquired, looking over at her mate confusedly. Thank you. I want to live. Imagine asking her about that if the two of them had not yet talked things out. Not too keen about being the next one you have to stitch up, he described, snickering to himself. Then, with a sly look over to Fither, he sheepishly added, well, now that I think of it, which earned him a disapproving noise and a giggle from his mate, who jokingly swiped at him, which he easily dodged. Well, actually, I really didn't have the chance yet, he explained, more serious. She is mostly working double shifts lately and thusly only has to show up every couple of days. She hasn't come in since I heard about the whole thing. But James was still hung up about what he had said earlier. Sheeta really seemed to not have a good reputation on board, even among the predators. He really wondered why that was. Even though a lot of people seemed to be quite afraid of her, it didn't seem like incidents like the one between the two of them happened regularly. What was it that made the people dislike that girl so much? It couldn't just be about the whole death world predator thing, since nobody really seemed to care all that much when he told them about his background. Or perhaps he was just really lucky with the people that he met. Or maybe the circumstances. After all, other than with Sheeta, nobody had been specifically told to be careful of him. Well, now you've gone and